Local productions on QTV are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome to Uncommon Sense. I'm Junior Doan and thank you for joining us. My guest today is Greg Cochran, President and CEO of TEA Inc., a professional environmental consulting firm serving clients throughout the United States and Canada. Welcome, Greg. TEA stands for what?
Good question. TEA stands for Toxicological Environmental Associates. We are a small, what we consider ourselves a niche environmental services firm. And what does that mean? That means we provide design and remedy solutions, cleanup solutions to companies that have, let's say, legacy issues or issues that they have under sites that they've manufactured on for a long time. Almost every major manufacturing organization in the world, to be honest with you, has problems that need to be addressed long term. Most of these problems occurred decades ago.
When they didn't know they were problems.
Exactly. And when there were no regulations, there were no conditions that they had to meet.
Or even maybe measurements.
That's true. That's exactly right. So our company helps companies like, let's say the large chemical manufacturing or oil and gas, automotive, many government installations or institutions, Department of Defense or NASA.
Nice to know they do that, really.
Oh, absolutely. Probably some of the largest areas of concern belong to the government, the U.S. government. And so we actually, it's a fairly large field in terms of companies that do what we do. We think we're different for a couple different reasons. One, as I mentioned, we're small. But that doesn't mean we're not powerful.
Right.
By small, we're nimble. We can turn our ship very quickly, or our boat very quickly in an industry that typically takes a long time to get things done, as you might imagine. So we're competitive, and we compete against very large companies that do this.
In solutions or price, how are you competitive?
Both. I think we are not, I'll use an analogy that I use all the time for folks. If you're sick, but it just is a general sickness, you're going to go to your family doctor. And your family doctor has a expertise in a certain area, maybe 2 or 3 different areas, and he'll help you along, how do you improve and how do you get healthy, right? But if you've got a condition that's, say, more acute or more serious, generally they'll send you to a specialist. And we consider ourselves in this industry kind of that specialist type company. We don't do everything. There are certain activities or certain jobs that clients want, and we basically say, thank you, but you really should call somebody else because we don't do that.
You have now 4 offices. Do each of them specialize in different areas of commercial remediation?
To a degree, yeah.
Like Baton Rouge may not have anything to do with Midland in terms of remediation focus, or is that irrelevant?
No, it's somewhat irrelevant, but I think your point is a good point. We do have 4 offices in the United States, one in Midland, Michigan, one in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and that was our original office, so that's still considered our headquarter office. Right. One in Moraga, California, and one in Santa Rosa Beach, Florida. I wish I was there, by the way. Just kidding. But we have absolutely, those offices were generated as a result of either a client need, our California office, for example, opened because we're doing a lot of work for a client in California. So we felt like we needed a presence there. The Baton Rouge office, as I mentioned, was our original office, and that's where we started. The Midland office opened because, to be honest with you, one of our key clients is Dow Chemical. And so we had several Dow retirees, including myself.
That's handy.
Yeah, that were already here in the Midland area, and
knew how to work with each other.
Right. There are some specialties in each of the offices, but predominantly we work together. So when a client or a problem or an opportunity presents itself, we make sure everybody knows about it. We have a way of communicating that internally within the company, and it doesn't really matter where you
Right.
are.
Right.
Yeah.
To pitch in. So you came from Union Carbide, right?
Correct.
Well, you read and you always know every institution has its own personality.
Right.
So in the transition when you became part of Dow, what did you first notice? Can you say?
Well, I started with Union Carbide in 1981, right out of college. So I'm a mechanical engineer by degree and went to work for a chemical company. Union Carbide was a large chemical company at the time, but basically helping them manufacture chemicals by supporting operations in
Yes.
terms of providing electricity and steam and utilities. Carbide's culture at the time, or Carbide size, Union Carbide size at the time, was quite large. They were 100 and some odd employees, 100,000 employees worldwide. Very large company, bigger than Dow,
Yes.
actually. And I have to talk about it. It's part of the legacy and it's part of the chemical industry. But in 1984, a major disaster happened, do you recall? The
Yeah,
Bhopal, India disaster. And that changed the company forever. And I think for good reason, to be honest with you. I'm not to say that Union Carbide was at fault. That's not I'm not an expert in that. I have my opinion, but I'm not an expert in what happened there or whatever. But it changed the company's culture tremendously to be very risk averse, as you might imagine. We could never let something like that happen again. And I think it changed the chemical industry. I know it changed Dow as well. But over time, as I said, that happened in 1984, and I would say, again, my opinion, by the middle 90s, the company had shrunk so much. Some of that was because they had to sell parts and pieces of the company off to survive. Some of that was choice. They wanted to get out of certain businesses and less risky businesses and get into more stable businesses, some of that. But over time, from 100,000 employees, by the time Dow acquired Union Carbide, it was about 11,000 employees. So it was 1/10 of what it was in its prime, if you will. And the culture was still one of very much risk averse and be cautious in making decisions. I can remember studying certain different business activities that we were doing and just recycling and never really coming to a decision because we were so risk averse. And I can remember very well the day that Dow took over Union Carbide. You will remember they announced it well, you won't remember the dates probably. I remember them well. They announced it publicly in August of 1999, and I can literally remember where I was the day they announced it. And it didn't close because of Federal Review and Security and Exchange Commission and the Federal Trade Commission and all of that. It didn't close until February of 2001. So for 18 months, Dow had the opportunity to study Union Carbide and what they wanted to do. And then so when day one happened, when the merger finally closed or acquisition finally happened, Dow immediately set about implementing all the changes that they had envisioned. And back to your question, the thing I noticed the most about difference in Dow was, even though they managed risk very effectively, they weren't nearly as risk averse as Union Carbide was. And I remember one of my first supervisors telling me that, in Dow we study it and we get 80% of it right, and then we launch and we get the rest of it right as we implement. And I found that, I remember it to this day, I found that extremely refreshing. That was like a breath of fresh air. You could finally make good decisions that were based on good chemistry, good science, and move, and make things happen.
What got you interested in studying to become a mechanical engineer?
Great question. My father, who was in the Air Force for 28 years, he's passed away now, but he was a mechanic at heart. And as I grew up, we were always working on things together. So nuts and bolts, the way things are put together was always kind of, let's say I learned that from my father, I guess. And that was the closest engineering degree to pursue that actually focuses on nuts and bolts and the way things work. And So that was it.
You know, that's really good for you, because I think that used to be true about cars, and now that's not true about cars. So luckily you had that exposure and experience with him.
Well, that's actually where we did most of our, let's say, experimentation. And we'd always, I mean, we never took a car to a mechanic, right?
Yeah.
When I was growing up, it was always we can do it ourselves, and spending days and hours in junkyards finding parts and pieces and bringing them back and putting them on our cars. But that was the culture of the time, right? And that's a lot of people did that.
Solution oriented.
It's impossible today. You're right. There's no way you could even think about trying to touch a car today, a newer car.
If someone wanted to get into your field of business right now, this remediation, what would they study? What would you recommend to them?
Well, you made a comment earlier, and it was really right on target. You said something about, when I mentioned, you know, the legacy issues for other companies, it was before regulations and before the requirements, or even before you could actually measure some of either the effects or the contaminant itself. Science has changed all of that, and Dow's a lot of that reason. I mean, many companies like Dow have spent a lot of time focusing on that. And they've also fostered in the academic world those sciences and those activities. So there are a lot of environmental management sciences available today in universities, like Delta College, for example, where you can study the effects of contamination in groundwater or soil. You can actually get a degree in that today. It was unheard of when I went to college. You know, nobody even thought about it. But today you can get, there's several ways you can get degrees to study those kind of things. Excuse me.
It seems like part of it is in the doing of it, the remediation, but part of it, which we haven't really mentioned, is the whole field of regulation.
Right.
And in rephrasing the question of how do you study to learn government regulation or thinking or whatever the fields are that you have to comply with.
It's another good point. I mean, the laws and regulations have been evolving constantly, right? So from the early days of Clean Water Act, which led to several different major laws. Now I'm talking about the U.S. only right now, but I could talk about the rest of the world because they've quickly evolved as well in those same kind of regulations. But that whole awareness in science and how do you detect things and what are the right solutions. I mean, there's so many examples in the past, for example, in let's say in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, when US EPA was really coming into their own in the US, and they would mandate, and I'm not faulting US EPA, but we didn't know what we didn't know. And so they would demand certain activities, dig something up, and take it to another place and bury it again, you know, in a landfill. And that kind of technology, if I could call it technology, that kind of mindset, approach was kind of the only way things could happen and change initially. And I guess it had its merit because you could put very hazardous substances that may be impacting workers or the public and put them in design places that have less impact. But you really didn't get rid of things, you just repositioned things. So the science of it and the chemistry and the understanding of how you destroy or change molecules so that they may be toxic in this form, but you can literally through chemistry, you can reconfigure that chemistry so that it's now benign. It's not toxic any longer.
You know, I wish you would talk about risk. When I was growing up, it was either risk-free, safe, or it wasn't, and meaning it was bad. But then, of course, I grew a little older, and
we learned a lot more.
And I found risk is just on a continuum. That's like you were saying about Dow. 80% we got it. We're going to do the rest along the way. Versus, so I think there may be people around who are like the way I used to be. Either it's safe or it's terrible. How does one, as a layperson, ask questions about anything, water, anything, in order to ascertain the risk level? And now by which I mean, there's always risk level. Some is I'm willing to take it. Some of
Right.
it doesn't really matter at all.
Correct. No, that's true.
But
That's
it's a
very true.
labor. You can't know everything, every field. And
No.
so what do you ask, or how do you think about it?
Well, first of all, it's always changing. I mean, so there's
Yeah.
never a simple answer, and it's never a single answer, right? It
Right.
changes and it evolves over time. And a lot of that is simply because we know more and more
Everything.
about everything, right? The effects of something in air or soil or water. Medical history or medical professionals are studying constantly, and that's where the T comes in our toxicology.
Yes.
Toxicologists worldwide are always studying the health effects of certain things on animals, and then they translate that to human beings. They don't study human beings unless they have, there's been exposure to people and they have the opportunity of taking their blood or
Right.
taking their sample. Most of the time, the science is based on what happens to a rat or a
Yes.
mouse or a guinea pig of some sort. And then they extrapolate that to the human physiology and they make assumptions.
Yes.
So there's a whole huge field around toxicology and human health assessments and environmental risk assessments and things like that. And so we do try to stay abreast of those things. The whole industry tries to stay on top of that activity, but it evolves over time, right? So what you thought, I'm trying to think of a good example, something that you thought was completely innocuous in the past, asbestos may be a good example,
Right.
where over time and the health effects of workers being exposed to asbestos, and it's not all asbestos as they found out. They originally thought any asbestos
Yes.
is bad, right? So get rid of it all. But now it's evolved to certain long fiber asbestos. So certain types of asbestos are more harmful than others. And so that just
But you
takes
see,
time.
you just taught me something, because I'm in the group that was all asbestos. So
Right.
because you're technical and you knew that, you knew to be
Right.
discreet about it, or
Right.
at least think about it in a discreet way.
Right.
And the reason I'm sort of interested in this, I think all of us are too scared about life. And things are always going to happen.
Right.
And so you really have to be in some position. And I find when people get pro something, they tend to exaggerate.
Right.
So
Right.
they exaggerate the negative or the positive,
That's
depending
true.
on what the ad
Absolutely
is.
right.
And
Yep.
so for someone who's not in the field, you don't want to be nuts on either side of that.
But it's a good point. I mean, it is a very good point. I mean, I think there are industries, there are whole industries or businesses out there,
Yeah.
if you will, that thrive on scaring the public so that they stop buying baby bottles made out of this type of
Yeah.
plastic because it's going to be whatever. And sometimes that's based on very poor science or very poor assumptions around the science. Sometimes it's inaccurate, to be honest with you. And they know it's inaccurate, but they can still play the scare card and really influence the whole industry. And then I think sometimes we assume things aren't harmful, and we do learn over time that they are. So, it's amazing. I think the question's a great question, and I don't have a good answer other than you just have to stay on top of things. You have to ask open-ended questions, good, solid questions. Don't preconceive or make up your mind before you really understand the facts, as best you can. Sometimes those facts are so obscure because they're so you really do have to be a PhD toxicologist to understand even what that report is talking about, for example. Well, I think I bring a little balance to the world of what I'm doing, because it's going to sound arrogant. I don't mean it to.
Common sense. Uncommon sense.
Yeah, uncommon sense. But in the confession of, I'm managing an organization now to manage some very sophisticated things.
Yes.
Well, I don't
saw the
know the
background of the people.
technicalities. I mean, we have very smart PhD chemists and toxicologists in our organization that are extremely smart. These guys know the science forward and backwards. We have engineers and chemists and geologists and hydrogeologists and degrees like that. Well, I told you, I'm a mechanical engineer.
Yeah.
So in my business, I don't have the technical expertise. I depend on those guys, men and women, to answer those kind of questions. But I always try to bring the practicality back to things, and I think that's kind of maybe it's the uncommon sense that I have. But managing it in terms of the risk and getting
Yes.
back to that question of, okay, do we really understand this well enough? And if we do, let's go. If we don't, we either need to
That's in
pass it on.
America, but you've worked in Saudi Arabia. And so I don't know how they work and don't work over there. Same standards, different country, different. But is it culturally different in the sense that you had to moderate how you explain things or
Yes.
the tempo of decision making? Talk a little about it, because most of us have, have no way of really asking that question.
I would say that, let me answer that question a little bit roundabout if I could. I'll get back to the Saudi comment, but globally I would say that the U.S. has been definitely a leader alongside of Europe, the European community, very sophisticated, very science-driven organizations that have really evolved the regulations rapidly, and they were the ground setting, they learned over time how to do things effectively and efficiently. And I'm not saying the U.S. system's perfect. I think it's got its flaws based on lawyers. We don't want to go there. But other countries have benefited greatly from that, and wisely so, right? Saudi Arabia is a great location for that. So what Saudi has done, they've evolved a lot slower, industrialized country, a lot slower in terms of regulations than the rest of the world. The Sadar project, if I could talk about that for just
Please.
a second. I was involved in that, that for 4 years with Dow and Saudi Aramco. That project was the largest chemical complex ever built at one time in the world. Phenomenal project. And it started with the best of Dow's principles and Saudi Aramco's principles, and that was the standards by which they were going to build and design and operate that complex. A lot of those standards were way out in front or in advance of, let's say, the environmental regulations that were in place at the time in Saudi Arabia. Some of the chemistry that we were making, for example, had never been produced in Saudi Arabia. So their environmental regulations or their regulations overall did not know how to address those things. So we helped them with that. And that's kind of Dow's standard. I mean, wherever they go worldwide, they bring the best of the technology, the processes, and the environmental standards with them. So for example, in Saudi Arabia, they have the regulations, but they didn't know how to measure some of those things or enforce some of those things. So we worked with them very closely, with the government. They were very willing to do that. And so they learned, or they will learn over time. There are many other countries worldwide, I would say, not to be...
But I was interested in the pace of, it just seems every country has a different sense of how close you can stand to a person, how fast you can get down to the business of getting together. Some, a lot of tea, a lot of coffee, a lot of meals. And I was interested in how did that work out?
Great point and a very good question, and you're exactly right. In Saudi Arabia in particular, it's a culture of you have to invest the time like this, talking to others, drinking a lot of tea, eating a lot of dates, a lot of meetings where you just feel each other out and get to know each other. And I have to admit, I mean, I'm a people person. I actually enjoy that kind of culture where it's not just about getting right to the business of business, but to actually develop a rapport, a trust, so that you can actually...
How do you do trust in a different culture like that one?
A lot of it is respect, right? You come into that not just assuming I'm going to... and I had my failures here in the Saudi environment where, I assumed I could launch right away into a business meeting before I ever get to know the person. And that's wrong, and that's against their culture. And so you have to reset, and you do take the time to get to know them much more on a personal basis or a one-off basis. And it's easy, actually, when you take that breath and understand that's how I'm going to accomplish business. It feels slower, so you feel like I'm wasting my time, right? I'm sick and tired of drinking tea and coffee, and I really want to get on to the business of business. But
did you? I always think Westerners think linearly, and I think people from the Middle East are more three-dimensional. because they've been in bazaars a long time. And so I don't know that we Westerners are so skilled. We don't know how to do that necessarily.
I think we do. I think
You
it's
do?
yeah,
Oh.
I do. I think but again, it depends on the person, right? I mean, not everybody on either side of that
Yeah.
equation, whether it's out of the U.S. or Europe going into Saudi, or not everybody coming into that from the Saudi perspective. It takes everybody working together to figure that out. But I think, getting back to the point of your question, I think you have to start with respect for their culture, their background, where they've come from, all the successes that they've had in terms of their, thousands of years of conducting business the way they do. Their religion and what they believe, that was always front and center. I mean, it drives everything that happens over there. I mean, it sets the standard for the day. Their Islamic beliefs are their law.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So prayer time, for example. I mean, in the Muslim faith, you have 5 different prayer calls a day. Well, that is how they practice their business. And so we're in a meeting, and a prayer call goes off, and they will say, "Excuse me, I'll be right back," and they'll leave and go pray. And you'll, out of respect, you'll wait and you'll say, "Absolutely, I understand." And you don't try to,
No.
you're not going to try to stop that or slow it down. You respect that. And in fact, it should drive your schedule, so that you don't schedule something where you're actually impeding with one of the prayer
flow.
times. So one of the cool things is there's an app for that, right? So you put that app on your iPhone, and you know exactly when those prayer times are going to happen. So you build that into your daily routine.
That's amazing. Thank you, Greg. So I've learned a lot, and I hope we have too. And that is a great advantage of doing things with your hands. And that is, he and his dad worked on automotive parts. To understand things three-dimensionally is to really live in a different world. He also learned from Dow versus Union Carbide, that if you get 80% there, you can do the rest in getting there. And that's really a nice way of looking about decision making in your own life. And we talked about risk. Think about, not everything is 100% ever, and try and get, I don't even say experts, but use uncommon sense about that. And the other thing is to be flexible and to keep grounded when you have experts and differing opinions around you. So have a wonderful week. Thank you for tuning in, and I promise you'll enjoy doing something nice for someone you know and someone you don't know. Thank you.
To contact Junia, send her an email at info@juniadone.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadone.com. Thanks for joining us. See you next time for Uncommon Sense with Junia Doan.
Local productions on QTV are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.